The world of Eldoria, a realm in transition. The land of Eldoria was a tapestry of ancient traditions and the slow, inevitable march of change. For centuries, the great cities of the old world had stood as monuments to the past, massive stone citadels where the voices of ancestors echoed in the halls of power, and where every ritual, law, and custom was bound by the unyielding weight of history. In these cities, the old ways were not merely followed, they were revered, woven into the very fabric of daily life. The people of Eldoria had long believed that to deviate from the traditions of their forebears was to invite ruin, a belief passed down through generations by the scribes and scholars who guarded the wisdom of the past. Yet, even as these traditions held firm, the world beyond, the great cities was shifting. In the frontier lands where the old laws did not hold sway and the people had long lived by their own customs, a new order was taking shape, one that did not look to the past for guidance, but to the future. The contrast between these two worlds was stark. In the ancient cities, time moved in measured steps, each generation bound by the expectations of those who came before. The ruling councils of the old world were composed of those who had studied the ancient texts, who had learned the ways of their ancestors, and who saw any deviation from tradition as a threat to the stability of Eldoria itself. But in the frontier, where the land was wild and untamed, the people had forged their own path. Here the young sought knowledge not from the dusty tomes of the past, but from the stars, the wind, and the land itself. They did not see tradition as a guide, but as a chain that bound them to an era that no longer had dominion over the world they now inhabited. This growing divide between the old world and the new was not merely a matter of ideology, it was a question of survival. The ancient cities, with their rigid adherence to the past, found themselves increasingly isolated, unable to adapt to the changing tides of the world. Meanwhile, the frontier lands, though full of promise, lacked the structure and unity that the old world had long maintained. And so, the question of whether Eldoria would embrace the future or cling to the past had become a matter of great consequence. It was in this time of uncertainty, as the world teetered between tradition and change, that a single individual would rise from the depths of history to shape the fate of Eldoria. The protagonist, a bridge between worlds. Elira Veyne was born in the shadow of the ancient city of Barith, where the weight of tradition was as tangible as the stone walls that encased its streets. Her family had long been among the scribes of the old world, entrusted with the preservation of the texts that chronicled the history of Eldoria. From a young age, Elira had been immersed in the rigid rituals of her people, learning the sacred scripts and the laws that had governed their ancestors for centuries. Yet even as she mastered the art of the scribe, a quiet unease stirred within her. While the elders spoke of the past as a guiding light, Elira could not help but wonder if it was also a shackle, binding the people of Eldoria to a way of life that no longer served them. Her internal conflict was not born of ignorance, but of a deep and growing curiosity. Elira had always been drawn to the stories of the frontier lands, the tales of people who had broken free from the old world's constraints and forged their own destinies. She had read the accounts of those who had left the cities behind, who had built new lives in the wilds beyond the reach of the old laws. These stories had filled her with a sense of longing, a yearning for something beyond the rigid traditions that had defined her life. Yet, to speak of such things openly was to invite the disapproval of the scribes and the elders, who saw any deviation from the past as a threat to the very foundation of Eldoria. Despite this, Elira could not ignore the growing divide between the old world and the new. She had seen the way the cities had become increasingly isolated, their people clinging to the past even as the world beyond their walls changed. She had also seen the frontier lands, where people lived by their own customs, unbound by the laws of the old world. And in that contrast, she found herself caught between two worlds, neither of which felt entirely right. Her motivations were not born of rebellion, but of a desire to understand. She had spent years studying the texts of the past, but she had also spent time in the frontier, where she had learned the ways of the people who lived beyond the reach of the old world's laws. She had seen the strengths of both worlds, the dangers of clinging too tightly to the past, and the risks of abandoning it entirely. And so, she had come to believe that Eldoria did not have to choose between tradition and change. It could find a way to embrace both, but to do so would mean challenging the very foundations of the world she had been raised in. It would mean defying the scribes, the elders, and the ruling councils who saw any deviation from the past as a threat. And it would mean stepping into the unknown, into the world of the frontier, where the people had long lived by their own rules. It was a path that would not be easy, and one that would test her in ways she had never imagined. Yet, as the world of Eldoria stood on the precipice of change, Elira knew that the time had come for her to choose her path and to shape the future of Eldoria itself. The clash of ideals, tradition versus change. The first signs of conflict emerged in the Grand Assembly of Vareth, where the ruling councils of the old world gathered to debate the future of Eldoria. For centuries, these assemblies had been the heart of the city's governance, where the scribes and scholars of the past had dictated the laws that governed the land. But now a new voice had entered the chamber, one that spoke not of the wisdom of the ancestors, but of the need for change. Elira Veyne had not come to the Grand Assembly as a scribe, nor as a representative of the old world. She had come as an outsider, a woman who had spent years in the frontier lands, where the people had long lived by their own customs. Her presence alone was enough to stir the gathered elders, who saw in her the embodiment of everything they feared, the erosion of tradition, the abandonment of the past, and the rise of a new order that did not look to the ancestors for guidance. The first to speak was High Archivist Kalen, the most revered of the scribes. His voice was calm, but his words carried the weight of centuries of tradition. The laws of Eldoria were not written in haste, he said, his gaze fixed upon Elira. They were forged in the fires of history, shaped by the wisdom of our ancestors. To question them is to question the very foundation of our world. Elira met his gaze without flinching. And yet, she replied, the world has changed. The people of the frontier have not abandoned the past, but they have found a way to live with it, to shape it into something new. A murmur of dissent rippled through the chamber. Some of the scribes nodded in agreement, while others scowled, their expressions filled with unease. The debate had only just begun, and already the tension in the room was palpable. Across from Kalen stood Councillor Dane, a man who had long been one of the few voices in the Grand Assembly who had spoken in favor of progress. He had once been a scribe himself, but he had chosen to leave the old world. Behind, traveling to the frontier lands where the people had forged their own way of life. Now he was the leader of a growing movement within the city, one that sought to bridge the divide between the old world and the new. The people of the frontier are not the enemy, Dane said, his voice steady. They are not rebels. They are people who have found a way to survive without the chains of the past, and they have done so not by abandoning tradition, but by adapting it to the world they now live in. Kalen's expression darkened. Adaptation is not the same as abandonment, he said. If we allow the old ways to be changed, we risk losing the very essence of who we are. Elira stepped forward, her voice rising above the murmurs of the assembly. And if we do not change, we risk losing everything. The old world is dying, and we are blind to the fact that the people of the frontier are not the enemy. They are the future. The chamber fell into a tense silence. For the first time, the people of Eldoria were not merely debating the past or the future. They were standing at a crossroads, and the question of whether they would embrace change or cling to tradition had become more than an abstract debate. It had become a battle for the soul of their world. Elira Veyne left Vareth that very night, the weight of the Grand Assembly's debate still pressing upon her mind. The city had been her home for as long as she could remember, its towering spires and ancient. Halls a constant presence in her life. But now, as she stepped beyond its gates, she felt the first stirrings of something she had never known before, uncertainty. The path ahead was not clear, and for the first time in her life she did not know whether she was moving toward salvation or destruction. Her journey took her first to the city of Eldon, a place where the old world still held sway, but where the people had begun to question the rigid traditions that had long governed their lives. Here she met scholars who had once been scribes of the old world, but had turned their backs on the past, seeking knowledge not from the dusty tomes of the ancients, but from the stars and the winds. They spoke of a future where Eldoria would not be bound by the laws of the past, but would instead forge its own path. Yet, even among these reformists, there was a fear that change would come too quickly, that the people of Eldoria would lose themselves in the pursuit of progress. As she traveled further into the frontier lands, Elira found herself in the presence of people who had long lived beyond the reach of the old world's laws. Here, tradition was not a rigid structure, but a living thing, shaped by the needs of the people who followed it. She saw how the frontier folk had built their own customs, not by abandoning the past, but by adapting it to the world they now inhabited. Yet she also saw the dangers of their way of life, the lack of unity, the absence of structure that had once held the old world together. It was in the city of Ardent, where the frontier met the old world, that Elira first encountered the true depths of the divide between tradition and change. Here, the people of the frontier had begun to settle, to build homes and establish trade, and in doing so they had come into direct conflict with the scribes and scholars of the old world. The ruling councils of Vareth had sent emissaries to Ardent, demanding that the frontier people return to the ways of the past, that they abandon their customs and submit to the laws of the old world. But the people of the frontier had refused. They had no desire to be bound by the laws of a world that no longer ruled them. Elira found herself caught between these two worlds, her heart torn, between the traditions of the old world and the promise of the new. She had spent her life studying the past, but now she saw that the past was not a guide, but a chain. She had seen the strength of the frontier people, but she had also seen the dangers of their way of life. And so she realized that the answer was not in choosing one side over the other, but in finding a way to bridge the gap between them. Her journey took her deeper into the wilds of Eldoria, where the land was untamed and the people had long lived by their own rules. It was here, in the ruins of an ancient city that had long been abandoned, that she made a discovery that would change the course of her life. Among the crumbling stones, she found a hidden chamber, its walls inscribed with the words of the past, words that spoke not of tradition, but of change. The scribes of the old world had not always been the rigid keepers of history. Once they had been the seekers of knowledge, the ones who had shaped the world not by clinging to the past, but by embracing the future. As she read the words, Elira felt something shift within her. The past was not a prison, but a guide. The future was not a threat, but an opportunity. And in that moment she understood that the path forward was not one of destruction or preservation, but of balance. The world of Eldoria did not have to choose between tradition and change. It could find a way to embrace both, to shape a future that honored the past without being bound by it. But as she stepped from the ruins and into the world beyond, she knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The people of Eldoria were not ready to accept this truth, and if she was to bring it to them, she would have to do so at great risk. The battle between tradition and change had only just begun, and Elira Veyne would soon find herself at the center of it. The breaking point, a choice that defines the future. The Grand Assembly of Vareth had not been the first time Elira Veyne had stood at the precipice of change, but it was the first time she had felt the weight of the decision before her. The city had been her home, the traditions of the old world had shaped her, and yet she could not ignore the truth that had revealed itself in the ruins of the forgotten city. The past had not always been a prison, and the future was not a threat, it was a possibility. But to speak such things in the halls of the old world was to invite exile, to invite the wrath of the scribes and the elders who had spent their lives preserving the traditions of Eldoria. Yet Elira had come too far to turn back now. She had walked the roads of the frontier, had listened to the voices of the people who had long lived beyond the reach of the old world's laws. She had seen the strength of their traditions, the way they had adapted to the world they now inhabited, and she had also seen the dangers of their way of life, the lack of unity, the absence of structure that had once held the old world together. And so she had come to understand that the answer was not in choosing one side over the other, but in finding a way to bridge the gap between them. But the people of the old world would not accept this easily. The scribes had spent centuries shaping the laws of Eldoria, and to them any deviation from the past was a threat to the very foundation of their world. The ruling councils of Vareth had already begun to take notice of Elira's growing influence, and they had sent emissaries to the frontier lands, demanding that the people there submit to the laws of the old world. The frontier folk had refused, and now the conflict had reached its breaking point. Elira stood at the center of the Grand Assembly once more, but this time the room was not filled with scribes and scholars debating the future of Eldoria. Instead, it was filled with the people of the frontier, the ones who had long lived beyond the reach of the old world's laws. They had come not as rebels, but as a people who had found their own way, who had built their own traditions, and had refused to be bound by the past. And now they stood before the ruling councils of the old world, demanding to be heard. High Archivist Kalen, the most revered of the scribes, rose from his seat, his voice calm but firm. "The people of the frontier have long lived outside the laws of Eldoria," he said. "They have abandoned the traditions of our ancestors, and have built their own customs. But they are not the future. They are an aberration, a deviation from the path that has guided our world for centuries. Councillor Dane, the leader of the reformists within the Grand Assembly, stepped forward. "And yet they have survived," he said. "They have built homes, they have forged trade, they have created a way of life that is not bound by the past. They have not abandoned tradition, they have adapted it to the world they now inhabit." Elira stepped forward, her voice steady. "And if we do not adapt, we will be the ones who are left behind," she said. "The old world is dying, and we are blind to the fact that the people of the frontier are not the enemy. They are the future." The chamber fell into a tense silence. The people of the old world had spent their lives preserving the past, but now they were faced with a choice: to continue clinging to the traditions that had once defined them, or to embrace the change that was already upon them. And then the moment came that would define the future of Eldi. The scribes of the old world had long believed that the past was the only guide, that the laws of Eldoria had been written in the fires of history and could not be changed. But now, as the people of the frontier stood before them, demanding to be heard, Elira knew that the time had come for a reckoning. She stepped forward, her voice rising above the murmurs of the assembly. "A prison," she said. "It is a guide, but it is not the only path. The future is not a threat, it is an opportunity, and if we do not choose to embrace it, we will be the ones who are left behind." The room was silent. The people of the old world had spent their lives preserving the traditions of Eldoria, but now they were faced with a choice. And as the weight of the moment settled upon them, Elira knew that the battle between tradition and change had only just begun. A future forged in balance. The chamber of the Grand Assembly was silent, the weight of Elira's words pressing upon the gathered scribes, scholars, and people of the frontier. For the first time in centuries, the old world had been confronted with a truth. It had long refused to acknowledge that the past was not an unyielding force, but a foundation upon which the future could be built. The scribes of the old world had spent their lives preserving the traditions of Eldoria, believing that to deviate from the past was to invite ruin. But now, standing before them, the people of the frontier had shown that tradition did not have to be a prison. It could be a guide, a living force that could shape the world without being bound by it. Elira stepped forward, her voice steady. "We do not have to choose between tradition and change," she said. "We can find a way to embrace both, to shape a future that honors the past without being shackled by it." A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the chamber. Some of the scribes looked to Callan, the high archivist, for guidance, while others turned to Councillor Dane, who had long been a voice for the reformists within the old world. But the people of the frontier had already made their choice. They had not come to destroy the old world, but to show that it was not the only way forward. Callan, who had once been the most unwavering defender of the old world's traditions, finally spoke. "The past has guided us," he said, his voice measured. "But it has also bound us. We must find a way to move forward without losing what has made us who we are." It was a statement that, for the first time, acknowledged the truth that had long been ignored. The people of the frontier had not come to destroy the old world. They had come to show that it was not the only path. And now the choice was before them, to continue clinging to the past, or to embrace the future without losing the traditions that had defined them. The ruling councils of Barith did not immediately declare their decision. The weight of centuries of tradition was not something that could be undone in a single moment, but the people of the frontier had already begun to change the world around them. They had built homes, established trade, and forged a way of life that was not bound by the laws of the old world. And now the old world had to decide whether it would accept that change or resist it. The Grand Assembly did not reach a decision that night. Instead, they agreed to a new council, a gathering of scribes, scholars, and people of the frontier, where the future of Eldoria would be debated, not in the halls of the old world, but in the lands where the people had long lived beyond the reach of the past. It was a step toward a new era, one where the traditions of the old world would not be abandoned, but would be adapted to the world that was now taking shape. Elira Veyne watched as the people of the old world and the people of the frontier stood together, not as enemies, but as two halves of a single whole. The past had not been destroyed, but it had been reshaped. The future had not been forced upon them, but it had been embraced. And in that moment she knew that the battle between tradition and change had not been won or lost. It had been transformed. The people of Eldoria had not chosen one path over the other. They had found a way to walk both, to shape a future that honored the past without being bound by it. And as the sun rose over the city of Vareth, casting its golden light upon the people who had once stood divided, Elira knew that the world was no longer a place of conflict, but of possibility. The old world had not been destroyed. The new world had not been forced upon them. Instead, they had found a way to walk between the two, to shape a future that was neither a rejection of the past nor a blind embrace of the unknown. And in that balance, Eldoria had found its true path, the legacy of a choice. Elira Veyne had not set out to change the world, but as she stood in the grand assembly of Vareth, watching the people of the old world and the people of the frontier stand together, she realized that she had done more than she had ever imagined. The battle between tradition and change had not been won with a single speech or a single act of defiance. It had been won through understanding, through the willingness of both sides to listen, to see the other not as an enemy, but as a reflection of their own desires, fears, and hopes. She had spent her life believing that the past was a guide, but she had also feared that it was a prison. Now she saw that it was neither. The traditions of the old world had not been a chain, but a foundation upon which the people of Eldoria had built their lives. And yet those traditions had not been immutable. They had been shaped by the people who had lived before, by the choices they had made, by the ways in which they had adapted to the world around them. And now the people of Eldoria had the chance to do the same. The scribes and scholars of the old world had spent centuries preserving the past, believing that to deviate from the traditions of their ancestors was to invite ruin. But now they had seen that the past was not a prison. It was a guide, one that could be used to shape the future without being bound by it. And the people of the frontier had not come to destroy the old world. They had come to show that it was not the only path forward. They had not abandoned the traditions of their ancestors, but had adapted them to the world they now lived in, forging a new way of life that did not reject the past, but embraced it. Elira had come to Eldoria as a scribe, a woman who had spent her life studying the words of the past, believing that they held the key to the future. But now she understood that the future was not written in the dusty tomes of the old world. It was written in the choices of the people who lived in the present. It was written in the way they shaped their lives, in the way they built their homes, in the way they spoke to one another, in the way they chose to move forward. And so, as she looked upon the people of Eldoria, both those who had spent their lives in the old world and those who had long lived beyond its reach, she saw not a division, but a unity. The past and the future were not enemies. They were not opposites. They were two parts of the same whole, each necessary, each valuable, each shaping the other. The battle between tradition and change had not been a war of destruction. It had been a war of transformation, of adaptation, of understanding. And now, as the people of Eldoria stood together, not as enemies, but as a single people, Elira knew that the world had changed, not because one side had won, but because both had found a way to move forward together. The traditions of the old world would not be abandoned, but they would not be the only path. The people of the frontier would not be forced to return to the past, but they would not be bound by it either. Instead, they would find a way to walk between the two, to shape a future that honored the past without being shackled by it. And as the sun rose over the city of Vareth, casting its golden light upon the people who had once stood divided, Elira Veyne knew that the world of Eldoria had found its true path, not in destruction, not in submission, but in the balance between tradition and change. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.